Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Civic Conversations from the Bill of Rights Institute. I am so excited to introduce you to our guest today. My name is Rachel Davison Humphries. I'm Director of Outreach at the Bill of Rights Institute. I've been with BRI almost 6 years now, and actually for more than half of that, I've had the honor of working with Dr. Anika Prather. Anika and I actually went to the same college. We didn't overlap quite because I was in the undergraduate program, but she was in the master's program. But that was how I learned of the amazing work that she does. So our guest today for this conversation on the missing voices, teaching primary sources from the Black authors in the history classroom is Dr. Anika Prather. So just a very woman who needs no introduction. She does so many things, so I'm going to have to condense it a little bit. But Dr. Prather earned her BA from Harvard and then went on to NYU. Oh, sorry, Howard. Howard, not Harvard. Her BA from Howard, which she's very proud. She's a legacy at Howard. Her father went to school there. Your brother too went to school there?
My mother and my brother, my whole family.
So just a Howard family, so my apologies. A BA from Howard, then went on to NYU and Howard, and her master's from St. John's College in Annapolis, which is where I also went, and then a PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. Her research focuses on building literacy with African-American students through engagement in the books of the Canon. She self-published a book called Living in the Constellation of the Canon, which is a fabulous text you can buy, but she actually just recently published a new book called The Black Intellectual Tradition, Reading Freedom in Classical Literature with Dr. Angel Adams Parham. You can buy that at Classical Academic Press. It just came out like last month, right?
It'll be officially in stores, I think, in June. But
officially in stores in June. In addition to her academic accolades, she is an entrepreneur in her own right. She founded the Living Water School, a unique Christian school for independent learners based on the educational philosophies of classical education, but married with the Sudbury model. She is married to an amazing man named Damon Prather. He's an engineer, and he's the financial manager of her school and all of her works. And they have 3 young children and live here in the DC area. So Dr. Prather, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with us.
Yes.
Our conversation today is really centered on these missing voices, on what the primary sources of Black voices are and why we should include them in our history and civics curriculum for students. So as you know, because you were one of the scholars, but I'm going to let our whole audience know about the resource that we had just published. So you were one of the key scholars on our resource, Plainest Demands of Justice, Documents for Dialogue in the African American Experience. And so for those of you that don't know, we asked the impetus for that resource, so it was published, it just came out in February, was how do we the people realize the promise of equality in liberty and justice for all people? So we asked that question, we invited scholars to contribute, and through primary source analysis, we have students explore a discussion of race and equality by rooting the conversation in natural rights and the work for constitutional change. So we look at this change agency through kind of 3 different pillars. You have legislators and policymakers, the Supreme Court, and we the people. But it's actually, the whole resource is divided into 3 different parts: a foundational primer on natural rights and the promise of liberty, equality, and founding documents; 3 chronological primary source sets covering the colonial era to the present day; and a capstone project is the final project. But all of these examine the concept of race in law and policy through the lens of African American history. Yes. So Plainest Demands of Justice, it's a comprehensive primary source driven examination of African American history that uses the principles of the Declaration as the foundation, and then has 90 different primary sources, all of which come from either Black voices or the Black experience, that allows students to really grapple with the complex and painstaking work to ensure a society faithful to the founding principles of liberty, equality, and justice. That resource is completely available to you free on our website. So you can go to billofrightsinstitute.org, find Plainest Demands of Justice, and all of those resources are modular. You can make them into playlists. You can share them immediately. The only thing you have to sign in for is if you want the answer keys. So please, if you have any questions about them, or if you are using them, let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the impetus. But the reason we're having this conversation is because it's an important conversation to have, right?
Yes,
so Dr.
yes.
Prather kind of has become a huge voice for including historical Black voices in what we consider the canon of primary sources. And so we wanted to invite her here today to tell a little bit about her story and then talk about her work with Plainest Demands of Justice, thinking about using primary sources and how we can better use them from Black voices, and really how we can support historical Black voices in the discussions in our classroom. So to start, my first question, and remember that there is a Q&A chat, let us know how you're doing. We'd love to know where you're coming from and who you are. There are a bunch of you here participating live, and then those of you who are going to view this asynchronously, we'd love to hear from you as well. So first, Anika, how did you go from being a classroom teacher to becoming one of the premier voices advocating for the inclusion of Black voices in the primary source canon?
That is a great question. And I ask myself that question literally every day. It's a frightening journey because I often wonder, how did I get here? It's also a lonely journey. And I was just sharing this with my family before we popped on. Because studying classically forces you to study these primary documents. It forces you to study the text from the beginning of time throughout history, as opposed to a textbook, as opposed to what somebody else thinks about something that happened. And when you are studying primary sources, whether it be the ancient text, the old text, straight from the horse's mouth, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and or the transcriptions of Sojourner Truth, for example, you really do get a different story than what either side wants to talk about. And so you find yourself almost saying, where do I fit? But I could not deny the truth. And as I began to teach my own students at my parents' school, they started a classical school. That was my entry point. And as many of you all have heard, I thought they were crazy for starting it. But my parents are both old school. And in my own personal research, I've discovered they were classically inspired in their K-12 education too. Now they're in their 80s. So that's before desegregation, and that kind of makes sense from the South, that they were familiar with this type of learning, but didn't know it was classical education. And so, but of course, when they discovered classical education, they felt led to start a school because this matched up with what they thought education was. Okay, so out of a love for them, not because I was passionate about it, I supported them. At that time, I had my master's in education from NYU in theater education, and my BA in education from Howard. So I came on, and I had been working in the public school for quite a few years, and I came on to support them. But instantly, as I began to see the effects of studying ancient texts, older texts, the works of the canon, and primary source documents. Because that's what I love about the canon, because the canon includes studying primary source documents. That's what, if anyone's familiar with Charlotte Mason, or another way of saying it is, these are living books. And so I began to see change happen in my students. Small school, about 50 students. And I was teaching all the great books courses and the history courses, which was a program called Omnibus. And Omnibus has you study history texts, primary sources, as well as ancient or canonical texts. And so as I began to see my students develop a worldview that was based on facts and history and an understanding of the human story, and how it began to address their self-esteem, they became more proud of who they were, their Black heritage. They didn't want to deny that. They became very literate in American culture and history. And that just began to open their eyes. And so that's where it became a phenomenon to me that I could not remove. I couldn't get out of my head. It kept me up at night. And so I switched over from researching the importance of arts in the classroom to the importance of classics in the classroom. And I brought the arts on the back end, where I showed how I use the arts to help students dramatize the lessons and connect to the lessons and bring to life what they were reading in the primary text. And so I always thought, though, that this journey was just going to be something I did privately through my parents' school. Their school closed. Long story short, I ended up starting my own based on the same philosophy. And I finished my dissertation. I put my dissertation in a drawer. It's going to be for my own knowledge. I had no dreams of becoming a voice in this movement at all. But St. John's would not leave me alone. And so they kept having me speak at different things. And I still felt it was safe. This is my little Johnny community. I'm just sharing with people who like what I'm saying, and I'm safe here. It's peaceful. And then, I don't know if he's listening, Jeremy Tate heard one of my lectures and just started telling everyone. And I ended up being on Twitter, and it just kind of snowballed. But as I began to just share what I was experiencing, what I had seen, not what I thought would happen, but things I had seen in my own life as an educator. And so, and writing about that in my dissertation and speaking on that and writing about it in different articles is what got me here. So I kind of got here by accident. And sometimes people, mistakenly call me the classic scholar. I don't call myself a classic scholar. I don't even think I am. I am an educator, that I am. I'm not saying that arrogantly. I have the degrees to prove it and the drama to prove it in my life, all those years in public and private school. But I happen to have a passion for classical education and bringing that into any classroom. And so I always say, I am the hype man for the classics community. And I'm hoping that what I say and the work I'm doing somehow supports you, because I feel that what you are studying, what you are doing is so important. So yeah, that's how I got here.
And what I love about your journey, and I've been, like I said, I've been kind of just cheering you on the sidelines every time I see something. Yes. One of the amazing things you do is, I think that so often what you do is you expose what's already there. It's not that we're asking for something new to happen. Right. It's just to recognize what is already a part of our national story, which is the Black experience.
Yes.
And that's a segue, because that's the fundamental crux of this project that we've done, the Plainest Demands of Justice resource, is to show that the Black experience was always part of the American story. Yes. They were in the same conversations. They were having the same, the same debates about the nature of equality and whether America is, whether the Constitution is written in blood, like all of those conversations were happening in the African-American community, in conversation with the white community.
They were talking to each other.
Yeah.
Through reading.
So my question for you is, you were a big part of kind of guiding and evaluating this resource. What about Plainest Demands of Justice really excites you?
I was excited, number one, that no one was trying to water down the story. When we, as Black people, we are very protective of our story. And so you're always nervous that someone's going to take that story and try to make it something that feels more comfortable for everyone, that leaves out certain details so it doesn't, ruffle too many feathers or offend anyone. But what I noticed in the work that we did with this is that didn't happen, that every story was told from even lynchings were talked about very clearly, and the advocacy work around that. That I appreciated, that it was true. And it was based on fact. There wasn't a lot of, well, we heard this political theorist say this, so let's put this document in here. It was the actual writings of Ida B. Wells, or the actual writings of Martin Luther King, or the actual writings of Bayard Rustin or James Baldwin. You all went, I remember sometimes sitting here when I was looking through some of the work saying, oh, they went in. That's what you say in the church. Oh, you went in, because you didn't leave any stone unturned. That was very brave, I feel. And I appreciated that. And so if a teacher, and it gives people resources, because people are hungry for, I want to do something different. I want to teach history truthfully. I don't know how. For decades, for centuries, American education has not taught history well. We need to own that. I feel Bill of Rights has decided to own that and try. I have
a distinct memory of being, I think it was 9th grade, and we skipped the Africa chapter in our text. Like there was a chapter there, we just didn't read it. Right?
Yep. And that's what happens. We find that happens in classics. I'm gonna give you a good example to prove my point. This week, I taught the story of the Iliad, and I introduced, I'm hoping I'm saying this name right. It's called, I think, the Aethiopis. It is an ancient Ethiopian text that has been lost except for a few fragments, but ancient Greek authors, historians, talk about it. And so it existed. And it's not hidden, it's right there. And as a matter of fact, they feel like parts of the Iliad are somehow connected to it. So I'm teaching this lecture and I give all of my documentation and research to prove I'm not making this up. And this student in my class says to me, this is not at my school, this is at, I think, University of Maryland. She says, I'm graduating with a degree in classics. Why have I never heard this? And it's not hidden. And this is not, please, Lord, don't, this is not a slight against University of Maryland. I mean, they have invited me to teach this course for this reason in the classics department, to uncover, to make sure that these stones aren't left unturned, where we can introduce the Black experience in classics. Well, that same thing doesn't just happen in classics, it happens in American history. It happens in all of world history. I was actually looking, I'm doing a talk on the history of theater coming up soon, and I wanted to talk about African theater. And I had several books on the history of theater. They had Asian theater, they had Indian theater, Greek, Roman, Italian. Tell me where Africa was. But there is a theater tradition in Africa, but that was not included in the history books. And these are books that are used at the university level. And so there is just this thought that nothing is really going on there to really talk about. But there is evidence, and there's documentation, and there's proof that the same cultures we see in America and Europe and Asia and wherever is in Africa too. And so taking that understanding and now bring it into American history, we've got to stop telling American history as if it's only the story of white people or the European people's struggle. America was formed and created through a struggle that included Black people. Right. And actually James Baldwin, I wish we could almost, but he has this quote that he says, he was talking to William Buckley when he said it, but he says, I built the railroads and I picked the cotton, and I did this. And he's not saying that white people didn't do anything. He's saying, stop telling the story as if my people didn't do anything. Because from the White House to the Capitol, all of these buildings that we tore, we just bought a building in Alexandria, Virginia for our school. And we found out that Alexandria, parts of it that are on the shore, were man-made on slaves' backs, putting the rocks in the water. And that plaque is there. Like, that's not hidden information. The plaque is there telling you that story, but is that in your history book? And so this is what I feel the Bill of Rights did, is they resolved that. They are seeking to say, listen, we're going to tell the American story, not as some segregated topic over here that we do for Black History Month or Frederick Douglass's birthday or Martin Luther King Day. This is a whole curriculum that you can immerse yourself in and know the story of America, including these voices that played an integral role in it. It's important.
I think, and you have so much experience. You've done so many wonderful courses where you've gone and you found the sources to be able to create an integrated curriculum. So integrated in that there are many voices represented in that curriculum. Can you talk a little bit about your process when you go about, you've taken on a course and you're like, okay, how do I make this course a course that integrates the different histories?
Yes.
Well, tell me a little bit about how you go about doing that.
It's a major research project. Do you want me to talk about K-12 mainly? I'll talk about
K-12 mainly. So we have this resource, and this is a place people can go. But I want to hear a little bit. You've done this. You've done this for 20 years now.
Yeah.
And I'd love to learn from you.
Yes. And so I use, because there are very few, and I know people are trying to rectify this, very few history books that do this correctly. So I'm not picky about history books. If I know it has some good information, I'll take it, even though I know it's biased. And then as I go through each unit, I ask the question, what people of color are here? Then I'll do a search, what people of color were at this moment in history? A perfect example, when we're talking about the Pilgrims, those who came in 1620, I just simply say, I don't take the assumption, okay, only white people were there with the Pilgrims and tell the story from there. I know my people were there because we are everywhere. I always tell my students, we are worldwide. All you have to do is ask. And I say, were there Black people with the Pilgrims? And sure enough, I found a Black Pilgrim who settled with the Pilgrims, Or if I'm studying about Columbus, was there a Black man with Columbus? Yes, there was. And you learn all about this Moor. I think was his name, Blackamoor was his name. And he helped him. Lewis and Clark. Was there a Black man or a man of color with Lewis and Clark? Absolutely. His name is York. And he helped them navigate their exploration. And the list goes on. You really can, it's really, so you can start, I always tell teachers, don't get frustrated. I'm not telling you to change your curriculum because you don't want to make the leadership mad if they're not ready for that yet. But what you can do is ask yourself a question, and you can do it for almost any national. What Native Americans were there? What Hispanic people were there? You know, what Asians were involved in this moment in time? Or what was going on in the East at the same time this was going on? Because we're so stuck that everything is this European perspective. And it's really a human perspective. And humanity is always intersecting. So as you get your book, and it doesn't take a long time. It could be, you go back to Columbus, for example, you could just take a moment, or Lewis and Clark or what have you, and just a moment of showing your students what people of color are intersecting there will change the dynamics of your class tremendously. Final example, if I say, I found through doing similar search, what was going on with the Native Americans during the Constitution. I found in PBS documentation from Benjamin Franklin that the Native Americans played a part in writing the Constitution, were invited to the Continental Congress because they were looking for an example of how these five Iroquois nations were able to establish peace after warring each other so long. And these five leaders showed them the Constitution of the Iroquois nation. And you can put the two documents up to each other and you'll see very similar statements. And it's not hidden. This is not, Ben Franklin and some of them did not try to hide this knowledge. Now, did they honor the natives like they should have? Absolutely not. And it's okay to talk about that. And that is how I tell history, this constant. And then sometimes I even tell my students, you look for it. And this is the process we're going through now. Some people ask me to write a curriculum. I just don't have time right now. So I do this until either I get the time to write my own or somebody else does it. But this is what we're doing as history comes to you, no matter where you are in the world. Find out what people of color are either intersecting at that time or something is going on at the same time someplace else with a person of color, so that people can begin to see the world outside of themselves.
Yeah, I think thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. And again, that's what we tried to do with Plainest Demands of Justice.
That's exactly
give you those entry points.
Yep.
Put the resources together. So just a little bit more about the resource. We have 90 different documents that are split up into 7 different lessons. But those 90 documents, they're actually about a third of them we've scaffolded so that you have 2 different versions.
Yes.
You can have the one that's like a little bit longer with the questions at the end, or you can have the one that's slightly shorter with the questions interspersed so that students can really understand. Because so often with primary sources, it's really it's a language barrier in many ways.
Yes.
And so approaching it with that kind of scaffolding is really important because the ideas may be compelling, but there's an actual language barrier for students who are so far removed from the regular English grammar of the time that they literally can't understand what's being said. So what we often do, or what I often did in my classrooms, is especially passages that are relatively short, I would read them aloud, or I would have students who I knew had a really good command of the language read them aloud, because when you do that, it removes a little bit of that friction because they can hear the intonation, they can see the pausing, they can see the stops. And as someone with a theater background, I know you've done a lot with read alouds as well.
And read alouds, and that I cannot tell you enough how important Socratic dialogue is, even on small passages, because that helps them tease out the reading. If you take a portion of the Constitution or a portion of Du Bois's passages, and that becomes, like you said earlier, an entry point. And I've also found too that when you do the read alouds and you do Socratic dialogue and constant discussion, it shouldn't be lecturing, take notes, fill in the blank. It should be they should become active learners of trying to understand this true narrative. They begin to develop in a real organic way the ability to understand that language. It awakens something in them to be able to do that.
And that's really what BRI is here to help them do, right? So we focus a lot on Socratic discussion.
Yeah.
Plainest Demands of Justice is the title. And if you go to our website, you can find it, or I'll actually have one of my teammates, if you could just pop that into the chat, that would be really helpful. The link to the curriculum, Plainest Demands of Justice. You'll see Dr. Prather is one of the scholars. We had a couple other fantastic scholars who contributed. So Anika, I think that you think a lot about primary sources from Black voices, and you think about them in the terms of the context of the classical community, but also U.S. history, because you've taught a lot of courses on, across the histories, both for your own school, but also in your discussions with a university, at the university level. You have a lot of things that you integrate with American history. Can you tell me a little bit? So one of the things that I think naturally comes out as a tension is this idea of the America not being for Black people, right? And there's a tension within the Black community around that. Right there, Frederick Douglass, if you read him at two different times in his life, will argue both sides, right? Or you have the tensions among the Niagara community, right? Like there was a serious tension there about whether or not America was for Black people or not. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that question when it comes to looking at the primary sources? Because you're going to get both perspectives, and it's going to be really a tense conversation, especially for Black students.
Yeah. On that note, you reminded me of the relationship between William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. And I'm really intrigued about that relationship. They started out working the abolitionist movement together, and their friendship broke up because one of them believed that the Constitution in America was inherently racist. It was flawed. There's no way, there's no hope for it. Basically, tear it all down, let's start over. And the other one felt that although the founders were flawed, many of the founders were flawed, and slavery happened, and that racism existed even in legislation, he did not feel the actual founding documents, such as the Constitution, were racist themselves. And to our surprise, we find that Frederick Douglass was the one who found the Constitution was not inherently racist. Now, when you read his What to the Slave is the 4th of July and all of his thoughts, he was very aware of racism. He was very aware of how racism looked in legislative spaces. He was not denying that, but he felt that the founding fathers did write a document that, and some people interpret it as it was in between the lines or somehow in the fine print, which makes it flawed. But Frederick Douglass did not agree with that. And so what it allows for as a teacher is to let's have a discussion. I just put a girlfriend of mine the other day on the same discussion. Let them talk about it first. We don't want to, one thing I'm also against, and this comes from classical education and from St. John's, I don't like to plant my thinking in my students' head first. I want to hear them talk. So we give them the primary documents. Let's say if we were doing a lesson on Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, and we'd look at the Constitution, we'd look at the Declaration of Independence or what have you, a Bill of Rights, all of those documents. And I'd want them to read it for themselves. And in spite of what we see in history, do you see racism in these documents themselves? Yes, we have the Three-Fifths Compromise. We have all of those things. Yes, I understand. I'm not saying there weren't racist laws. But what Frederick Douglass, I think, was trying to say is that the foundational documents have been able to be used to prove that things were unconstitutional. And so I think what I try to teach my students is this thin line difference. And I try to guide them into seeing it, but at the same time, if they don't agree with me, they are allowed to hold to that. But I at least want them to explore these primary documents based on some truth and some data. There's a very thin line. Was America founded to be racist, to enslave? Was that why it was created? Or did racist people found it? That's weird. I know that sounds strange. But why are they a little bit different? Because if I do believe this, that those who founded the country, many of those, not all of those, but most of those, when they created the country, when they wrote the document, they didn't have us in mind at all. We were cattle. So they really did mean for man to be free. They just did not think we were mankind. That's the problem. And that's the part people need to understand. So they were able to write these documents that all people should be created equal. But why do I need to mention these Black people when they live in my barn and they're cattle? Like they're not a thing to me. That's what we need to talk about. They're beyond inferior. They're just not human. Like if you look at Thomas Jefferson's, and I think that's in these documents, Notes in the State of Virginia, he was very clear that we were animals. We smelled, we're dumb, we're animalistic in our behavior. And so that many of them saw us, Abraham Lincoln even saw us as inferior. So even though he had a very different perspective, of course, than Thomas Jefferson. So this thought of us being inhuman was in the back of their mind. So when they created these documents, they were thinking for mankind. Now, sadly, once we proved we were human, help us God, then we could take that document and it applies to us. And that's unfortunate, but that's what began to happen. And we could say we're human. This anthem applies to me. This Constitution, these Bill of Rights are for me. And the battle to continue to have that conversation has been a hard one, and to prove the point, and your unit does this, it addresses this, because just because slaves were free doesn't mean that people's thinking was right, because then you get Jim Crow. And my father lived during the time period of Jim Crow where he couldn't sit on parts of the bus. I mean, life was threatened if he was in the white area. And so we couldn't vote, so we were still treated as less than human. They still struggled to believe. And people like Martin Luther King Thurgood Marshall had to held on. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Right, and that's like the special genius, and whether it was intentional or not, those words have given support to every marginalized community.
Every single one.
Every single one. To advocate for their agency, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's part of that dialogue. That's part of the conversation is, whatever you think of the intention, that proposition that all men are created equal has given the weight needed to make it so that there was something to stand on when it came to advocacy for agency, whether that was Native Americans, very early on, you had the Cherokee chiefs and the Cherokee women advocating for this back in the 1800s. Then you had women in general. Then you had the abolitionist movement. All of those endeavors to greater realize this idea were built on that proposition, right?
And
whether that was intentional or not, that's a different conversation.
Well, I mean, and this was one of the things when I was reading the Federalist Papers at St. John's, one of the things I feel, and you can prove this by reading some of these primary documents, as you saw the founding fathers, some of them didn't agree on this. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, these were not perfect people. Please don't go away thinking that that's what I'm saying. But they definitely didn't agree with how Black people were being treated. I definitely want to party
with Franklin. I'm not sure I would want to be his.
But my thinking is that because the conversation on what to do about slavery and how to relate to Black people did come up. And I think there was an intention, and this is what Frederick Douglass was saying, to leave this document in this open-ended, because they could have said all men are created equal except Black people. Like they could have put that in the fine print. I'm not excusing anyone. I just hope everybody's hearing me out when I say this. And so I think they left it open-ended, and it was a cowardly thing to do, actually, in my opinion, with the hopes that over time humanity would have this discussion around this primary document and it would work itself out. Thomas Jefferson, in all of his depravity, even said, his justice is going to reign in a supernatural way for this. Now, why he didn't free the slaves or advocate for that, but he's dead and gone. So, but now we can look at these primary documents. We can teach our students to read them, to teach them. And this is another thing I'm doing in my government class at my school is we're working through this curriculum called constitutional literacy. It's a little bit politically biased, but the guy does such a great job explaining the Constitution. And I'm saying, you need to know this for yourself. There are things, rights that my students didn't even know they had. I'm saying this could possibly protect you just by knowing this. And so we all need, and that's what our activists did. That's what even Black Panther knew the foundational documents. And those documents supported the work that they were doing. Yeah, and so I think that the founding fathers were hoping that these conversations would continue, and there would be this continual grappling with this tension.
And I think you see that in a lot of like the notes on the convention and those sorts of things.
Yes.
And that's a big conversation. There's a lot of literature there. And I think that but that's the tension we want to explore. And that's why we wrote the curriculum. That's why you do the advocacy you do, is so that we have the words themselves to have that conversation. And I loved what you said about, creating space for student voice before you kind of jump in with your own ideas.
Yes.
We understand, and Dr. Wayne Journell is a theorist who talks a little bit about whether you can really hold space or whether you should just be upfront, because then it just makes things clean and clear. And I know that's a tension within the kind of educator community, because you have these two kind of poles, right? You have the one pole where you want to create space and make the conversation very open. So you don't want to put any of your own ideas in there, because that would crowd out the ideas of young people who are very impressionable.
Yes.
And at the same time, we have a duty to be models of conviction for young people as educators. And so how do we balance that tension? Well, I think it's just recognizing when you're doing one or the other and coming into it intentionally, right? Yeah. So my rule was always they could learn my ideas, but it just couldn't be during the unit. And it couldn't be during class time. So if they wanted to come at lunch and talk to me about stuff we'd already learned about, I was happy to do that with them.
Yeah.
But in the class, I wanted to protect the space for the class. Yeah. But they also knew I had my own opinions. And if they were really eager to hear what they were, I was happy to talk to them about them after we had closed whatever the conversation was.
Well, I think the issue is, being history teachers, you're teaching them to be a participant in our democracy. This is not just head knowledge. And I'm gonna give you a personal example of how we do it. This was the year Philandro Castile had just been murdered. Now, as a school principal and teacher and administrator, that one hit home for me, because he was the lunch worker, and I always had a special relationship with the lunch workers. Would always bring me something to eat.
I remember.
So I had some very strong convictions about the flag and all that. I was in my own space, and I was tempted to bring that emotion into the classroom. And I just felt a conviction in my own self that this wasn't fair to put this on them. So instead, we had a discussion. And I said, how do we all feel about the pledges? And it was kind of like, a lot of kids were like, I want to keep saying the pledges. Some kids were like, well, I want to kneel right now. I'm not really feeling the flag right now. So true to the democratic school we try to be, you have to be quiet, but we and the students created this. We will still have a time to honor the flag, but you don't have to. You can't disrespect, you can't make fun of people, you can't make rude noises and do things and stomp off and act rude during that time. And we all the teachers, everyone joined in. There were days where I sat down, and there were days I stood up, and there were days some students knelt, and some days students put their hands on the chest. It was completely free space. But that's democracy. I mean, that is the beauty of our country. And the reason why I felt strongly about that, and this is, again, I grew up going to a school, it was a traditional Christian school, where we didn't have an opinion. Like, we could, if you weren't Republican, you were in sin. Or if you didn't vote a certain way, you were out of the will of God. And I was determined not to create a school like that, but a school where all children, as long as they respect each other's freedom, that we have this freedom to have a voice and to glean understanding from the primary sources. And that has been very liberating for us. And it's made students want to be interested in politics and government, because they feel like, I am free to understand this story. I am free to express my opinions about this. And that's another way I see history should be taught too. Oh, I can't hear you.
we're unfortunately coming up on our time. We're going to be a little short, but James has had some really interesting questions in the QA, so I want to make sure we get to those.
Okay.
And I think the first one we already touched on. He asked the question, like, is there a difference between finding the Constitution systemically racist in parts while also simultaneously capable of increasing liberty for all? And I think we touched on that. I think we said yes. There, you can hold both ideas at the same time, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's there. You can hold both of those as true. That it is systemically racist in parts, and again, whether you think this was intentional or accidental, I personally think it was intentional. That idea that all men are created equal is propositional, and allows everyone to claim it, whether or not that was intended. And so his other question is actually really interesting, and that's cultural synergies. So you mentioned being really protected, that Black communities and all minority communities, all communities are rightfully protective, but especially Black communities, since the cultures were literally ripped from them, are very protective of their kind of cultural norms and their histories. How do you feel about kind of synergistic retellings or blending culture so that students are exposed to kind of Black culture, but it's done through the lens of something that's more well known to them? So for instance, he's talking, I'm not familiar with this, but it's something called the Gospel of Colonus. It's a musical retelling of the Greek tragedy done with Black gospel singers and music. How do you use those kinds of things as kind of a cultural
that's what
awareness?
Black people, absolutely. And Black people have always done that. I mean, you have the paintings of Romare Bearden, who did the Black Odyssey. I mean, and honestly, people don't realize this, but the Harlem Renaissance is very much inspired by classics.
Absolutely. I mean, it's literally called the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes, exactly. And Alan Locke said that he wanted to tell the Black story in a different way. And all of these scholars read the Canon. Like, they would sit around and discuss the Canon, parts of the Canon together, weaving parts of the Canon into their own writings. And so you kind of, like, if you look at the story of Their Eyes Were Watching God, you think of the Odyssey. She's going on this journey through her life from a young girl until in her 40s, experiencing love, not love, living in different parts of the state, finally finding her way back home. And so those stories like that, Zora Neale Hurston, definitely part of the Harlem Renaissance, part of that group with Alan Locke, who believed that the Black story, Langston Hughes, all of them, they believed the Black story was its own epic. And so they were inspired by these Greek stories and retold the Black story, weaving in traces of that. And so, so I definitely agree, because that's what we have done. Like, we did that with the Negro spirituals. We took, the Bible and the old hymns that the slave masters were singing and turned it into "Go Down, Moses, Way Down in Egypt Land." We were always taking the West. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, we were also, not only are we from Africa, but we're also from the West. We were always taking bits and pieces of the West and weaving it into our own story and recreating our own story. That is actually the Black story of America, in America, is us constantly doing that.
Yeah, that evolving and integrating and while preserving and honoring, right? So on that note, I just want to see, is there anything that we didn't touch on when you were like, I hope we really touch on this thing, when we were planning this session? Is there anything we haven't covered?
I do want to say that those of you all who have enjoyed what we were talking about, you're excited maybe of going back into your classroom and talking with your family and friends and your coworkers and administrators about this new focus on using this curriculum and opening your eyes to see the color that's in history. Some people are going to be resistant. It's good. It's a new way of thinking about history. There are going to be those who think you're not angry enough. There are going to be those that think you're talking about Black people too much. But this story doesn't belong to anyone. It's all of our story. It's not anything we can fix. if we go back to the beginning and move our way forward, you're just going through the journey of telling the whole story of all of the people that intersected in this space. And you're leaving no stone unturned. And just be brave as you do that.
And look Anika up on Twitter, tell her about it. She'll come help you out. So thank you so much, Dr. Anika Prather, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to all our guests. It was great seeing you all. You had some fantastic questions. Again, we're the Bill of Rights Institute. Our newest resource is Plainest Demands of Justice. You can find Dr. Anika Prather all over the internet. She has a website. She's also an actress and a vocalist. She has a SoundCloud where she has podcasts, but also her music. So she is a woman of many talents, and we're so grateful that she's a friend of the Bill of Rights Institute. And I hope I also call her a personal friend. So thank you so much, Dr. Prather. Thank you to all of you. And we look forward to hearing from you. So have a wonderful evening. Teaching civics is hard work. The Bill of Rights Institute is here to help. Let us know if there's anything we can do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Bye, everyone.